さて、それではお時間となりましたので、これより新時
We'd
代
like to
の
start the next
KYC ル
session,
ール、暗号資産とFATF ルールの競争に向けてをテーマに、
the travel rule
プレゼンテーションを
towards
行ってまいります。
a viable
はじ
implementation
め
of
に
our
パネリストの
of
皆様をご紹
standards.
介させていただきます。
I'd like to introduce the
まず
panelists
は
to start
チェイ
with.
ナリシスグローバル政策責任者ジェシー・スピーロ様、
And first
続
is
いて
Mr. Jesse
IDEXA
Spira,
代
Global
表
Head of
アクセス
Policy
代
Chain
表アンソン・
Analysis.
ジール様、
Next is Mr.
続い
Anson
て
Zio, a chair of IDEXA,
BG2C
a chair
グローバルデ
access,
ジタルファイナン
and
スアドバイザリーカウンシルチ
Mr.
ェアマルコム・ラ
Malcolm
イト様、
Wright, Global
最
Digital
後に
Finance
モデレーターを
Advisory
務める
Council
のは
Chair and
金融庁
COO
国際室
DigiNext,
国
and the
際決済
moderator
金融
will
班
be
パ
Mr.
ドコンタクトグルー
Takahide
プ共同議長
Habuchi,
田淵
Assistant
葉月です。
Commissioner of
田淵さん、
FATF
どうぞ
and
よろしくお願いいたし
International
ます。
Affairs Officer JFSA, and also co-chair of FATF, the Virtual
そ
Assets
れでは本番
Contract
の
Group.
進行は田淵さんにお願いしたいと思います。
And I would like to pass over to Mr. Habuchi to take over from here.
Welcome to this session of Travel Rule. I'm Takahide Habuchi of GFSA, also a co-chair of Virtual Asset Contact Group of FATF, which monitors the implementation of new FATF standards on virtual asset and virtual asset service providers, including Travel Rule. And Travel Rule is without doubt a very important topic and hot topic these days. And also, it's a very timely topic, as in July, FATF published the 12-month review report. And in that report, FATF actually assessed the progress made by public sector and private sector regarding the implementation of the new FATF standards, including Travel Rule. So it's my great honor to moderate this session with my wonderful panelists, Malcolm Wright, from GDF, Anson Zil of IDEXA, and Jesse Spiro of the chain analysis. And I hope they will share with us the perspective from the industry and from the solution provider. And I myself will add some points from FATF perspective, as well as from the regulator's perspective. So first of all, I want each panelist to introduce yourself. So maybe starting with Spiro, starting with Jesse, and then Anson and Malcolm. So Jesse, please.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be speaking at FinSum again. I was there in person last year. I wish I could be again this year. But in spite of the fact, a pleasure to be back. I'm Jesse Sparrow. I'm the global head of policy and regulatory affairs for chain analysis. Most of my work directly involves engaging global regulators and governments and industry bodies on the emerging regulation that we're seeing in space. So very happy to be discussing FATF and the travel rule today.
Thank you, Jesse. So Anson, please.
Hi, thank you, Takahide-san. My name is Anson Zil. I'm the chair of the association IDEXA, which is an association of different trade associations in the world in the cryptocurrency space. So we have Crypto Valley Switzerland, Blockchain Australia, ourselves from Access in Singapore, and a number of others as well. I'm also the chair of Access, the Blockchain and Cryptocurrency Association in Singapore. We worked a lot with MAS and obviously with through IDEXA working with the FATF as well. But most importantly is we're here to help the members to achieve what they need in the expectations of the travel rule for MAS. So we have completed the code of practice, which outlines the AML-CFT guidelines and an independent assessment for the RegTech firms that are here to help the firms for the travel rule.
Thank you, Anson. So next, Malcolm, please.
Thank you, Takahide-san, and also to the organisers for inviting me to speak today. And I hope the conference continues to go extremely well. So my name is Malcolm Wright. I'm Chief Compliance Officer at a blockchain financial services company in Hong Kong called DigiNext, and we have a virtual asset exchange called Equos. I'm also the Advisory Council Chair and co-lead of the AML Working Group for Global Digital Finance, which is an industry body that looks at setting standards across the industry for digital assets.
Thank you, Malcolm. So now we are all familiar with who you are and what you do. So I want to start asking panelists some questions regarding the travel rule. So my first question is to Malcolm. So first of all, what is travel rule and why is it so important?
Thank you. So we have to look back a little bit here at before the days of regulation for crypto, and particularly the big concern was maybe crypto is being used by criminals and terrorists to be able to move their illegal funds from one person to another. So the FATF that Takahiti-san mentioned before really set out about laying down some guidelines as to how to regulate crypto firms, the same way that payment firms and banks have been regulated for a number of years. One of these particular rules is called Recommendation 16, but in the US it's more commonly known as Travel Rule. And that is where the information, when a transfer is sent between two exchanges, or otherwise called Virtual Asset Service Provider, or VASP, when a transfer is sent between two VASPs, information also needs to be sent from one VASP to the other about the originator and the beneficiary of that transaction. So if I wanted to send a transaction to Anson, and we both used exchanges, my exchange would send my details to Anson's exchange. And the reason for this is really so that if, for example, law enforcement want to come into an exchange and say, right, show me all of the transactions that have happened, and to take a look and say, right, okay, we can see who the sender was and we can see who the beneficiary was for every single transaction. And they can do that whether they go to the originating exchange or the beneficiary exchange.
Thank you, Malcolm, for your very comprehensive explanation. To ensure that audience get it correctly, as he explained, the travel rule is already mandatory for the other financial institutions, but FATF introduced that requirement about 1 year ago. So, and now industry is working very hard to meet that requirement. So having said that, let me move on to my second question to our panelists. This question is to Malcolm and Anson. And what has the industry done so far to comply with the travel rule and to find the technical solution for the travel rule? So Malcolm, could you start?
Yeah, so I shall start from the, there's a number of different aspects. So the first is, how do you actually send the information from one exchange to another? How does that information actually travel with the details of the transaction? And for that, there's a couple of industry solutions, and then there's also some commercial solutions. And with that, we also looked at how we can make sure the information is sent in the right way, and so that it will always be received as it was intended when it was sent. So, for example, a date of birth. If a date of birth needs to be sent, would you put it in US format or would you put it in UK format? So is it day, month, or month, day? And so we created a standard, Anson, myself, somebody called Sean Jones, who was a former regulator in Gibraltar, and the Chamber of Digital Commerce. We formed a group called the Joint Working Group for Intervasp Messaging Standards, and we have a website, intervasp.org. And on that website, we set out, or as a group, we set out a standard for how the message should be formatted when it was sent from one exchange to the other. And all of the technical solutions have now really started to adopt that standard. so that it makes it easier for exchanges to start to transmit that information. I'll let Anson sort of add here as well.
Yes, thank you. So what Malcolm said basically is a good segue to what are still the current challenges and what's being done. I just want to jump back to the very beginning in Vienna, 2019, when we first had the private consultative forum with FATF. Back then, obviously, all the regulators from different countries were looking for a solution, giving the reins on this project, so to speak, to the industry. And a lot of things happened. One is many companies started working on a solution themselves, but we're seeing problems that there is no particular language or standard that comes together. Hence, that's why we, me, Malcolm, and Chamber of Digital Commerce, led by Amy, formed the joint working group. And now with that, there are many different solutions that are coming up that is implementing this standard, as well as different protocols, if you will, that are also implementing this standard. You have Trissa from CipherTrace, that it's a network that implements a standard. You have OpenVASP, and you have other solutions also doing the same thing. Now we're at the stage where implementation is happening. The standards have been implemented, and now getting the so-called alpha and beta customers on board to try out. And now I will see the realistic aspects of it that needs to be iterated in the coming few months. And yeah, but the challenge right now is getting more and more companies together to go on this standard. But we're getting there already.
Thank you very much, Anson and Malcolm, for introducing what you have done and also what kind of challenges you face. So the next question is to Jesse, and the question will be, from the perspective of the solution provider, what have you done so far, and what's the current challenges you face?
So I think it's important to answer that question to kind of divide into two categories. There's really three, if you will. One is kind of the industry solutions that have been identified, right? The other, there are some commercial solutions that have been identified. And then there are providers like Chainalysis that provide support, if you will, to identifying and kind of navigating the travel rule by way of some of the information that we can provide. So Chainalysis has taken much like FATF has in relation to the kind of solution that's going to be an agnostic approach. And what we have done is we've decided to and have enhanced our products and services that we offer to support travel rule compliance. So ease of access in identifying obligated transactions, right, that trigger travel rule, right, that hit the threshold, for example. Being able to identify and mitigate potential cases in relation to fraud. And then the third part is that while there are specific requirements for the travel rule, right, when it comes to compliance, depending upon what your risk appetite is as a firm, you may want to do more, right? So you might want to do real-time transaction monitoring, which we provide as well. And dig a little bit deeper in relation to the processing. In addition, using Chainalysis, you can identify many of the counterparties, not all, but many of the counterparties already in relation to those VASPs. And it's possible in doing so, if you're using Chainalysis, you can see what the on-chain and what the activity is in relation to those exchanges. And again, it might be a situation where based on the activity, if you see a certain amount of illicit activity flowing through that exchange, that you might not want to process that transaction. In relation to kind of the issues, some of the issues that we've seen, this is more holistic in relation to the solutions that exist right now. There's a number of solutions that have already been identified, as I just mentioned. And the expectation is a number will probably be used initially for a number of different reasons, I think, that we'll discuss later in this session. But interoperability in relation to those different kinds of solutions is potentially certainly going to be an issue. There's also the issue of the sunset issue, wherein while some of these solutions will allow you to retroactively process that kind of information and identify it, others might have more difficulty in doing so. There are some others also, in relation to specific, maybe nuanced jurisdictional requirements and how those potentially are going to impact. In the US, for example, where there is that legacy travel rule requirement as part of the Bank Secrecy Act, the threshold is actually lower. So these are all things that I think are still being worked through. But, I think it's promising in that there's been a lot of progress thus far.
Thank you, Jesse, for giving us a very comprehensive picture of what solution providers has done and also what kind of challenges you face. So before moving on to the next question to our panelists, let me share what FATF said in 12-month review report published in July, where FATF assessed progress by public sector and private sector regarding the new FATF standards, including travel rule. And I hope that might, that might be a good short summary of what you panelists have said so far. And also, I want to quickly add that the Japanese government, especially the JFSA, contributed a lot to finalization of this report with me as a co-chair and with my colleagues as an active participant of this project. And according to the report, overall, there has been a progress made, as mentioned by the panelists, but also issues to be addressed to achieve the effective implementation of travel rule. Let me start with progress. And the good news is that industry has developed a messaging standard, as Malcolm mentioned, to ensure interoperability of travel rule solutions. And also, now the tech solutions are being developed in order to implement a travel rule for virtual asset industry. But bad news is that still there are no holistic tech solutions for travel rule implementation that has been adapted, that has been established and adapted globally. And also the report, the FATF report, also introduced several issues that need to be addressed. The issue includes the identification of counterparty VASPs, transaction with unhosted wallet, and regulatory differences. Jesse mentioned the name of the Sunrise issues and also the issue of privacy and interoperability. And also the report calls upon industry to redouble its effort to develop a holistic tech solution for travel rule. And FATF is also committed to undertake the second 12-month review in June next year. And I hope the FATF report, 12-month review report, published in July will help the industry initiative as well as the conversation between relevant stakeholders. And having said that, let me move on to the next question to our panelists. And I think this question will be to Jesse. And our focus will be on the future from now. And my question to Jesse is, what will solution provider do next? And will there be a widely adapted solutions by June next year?
Sure. So I like the fact that you said solutions, because I do think that is going to be what occurs. The good news is, as I mentioned, many of these solutions have worked, providers and solutions that have been developed have been done so diligently since the implementation of the FATF virtual asset recommendations. And as such, many of them are now at the point where they're initiating pilots. In fact, in the news, I think a few days ago, there was a demo wherein a transaction was processed that was travel rule compliant. It used the inter-VAS messaging standards. I believe it used open, or it was PLP that executed. But the fact is that many of these solutions are now in pilot. So they're building coalitions of, exchanges or those in the space that are kind of signing on to use these solutions. And I say coalitions because it seems that there are going to be different solutions probably adopted in different jurisdictions. In some jurisdictions, multiple solutions adopted, like in APAC. And so the next step, I believe, is that we're going to see pilots certainly within the next 6 to 9 months. I think that it's realistic to see there's going to be a lot of progress there. In relation to by June 2021, my expectation would be that many of these solutions will be live and viable, and there will be exchanges that are in compliance at that point as well.
Thank you, JC, for your explanation. I really hope it will happen by June next year, and we will celebrate that in our next 12-month review at FATF. But anyway, let me move on to the next question. And I think this question is to Anson and Malcolm. And my question is, what will solution provider do? What will industry do next? And will there be a widely adapted solutions by June next year?
Okay, so there are two parts to this question, and I'll answer the first one in terms of the industry. So now the next part of what the industry has to do, working with the different trade associations as well as the different VAS, is to really communicate with the different regulators around the world. Because FATF has their own recommendations on what needs to be done. But now the next challenge, if you will, is each regulator's interpretation of the travel rule is very different, and the expectations to reach what they think is enough is also very different. So a very simple example would be we recently have the Hong Kong, one of the VAS recently got a license to become a virtual asset brokerage. That was for Hong Kong wise it's good news. But in terms of in Singapore, the challenges still exist, as many of the firms are still trying to grasp what MAS really wants in terms of the expectations. So one simple example I would give is when MAS asks the different firms how are they going to interpret the travel rule, many have said that they will use this and this solution. But what MAS really wants is to see the underlying mechanisms on how this is going to be done. So that's MAS, but different regulators have worked differently. So my point is, for the first question, the industry needs to work with regulators together to harmonize everything, because which links to the next part, the solutions will also not only need to implement what FATF has, but it also needs to implement the different jurisdictions' expectations into the solutions as well. Malcolm, did I say too much?
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. Let's hand over to me. Okay, so I think there's 4 things that came to mind when I think of this question. The first one, which is the obvious one, is that exchanges will need to do KYC. You need to understand who your customers are. Because if you need to transmit that information, you need to have that information to begin with. So KYC, exchanges understanding who their customers are, is really going to be the first thing. The second thing is if you are an exchange that is receiving information from other exchanges, you need to be able to store that information correctly. So exchanges will need to think very, very carefully about this information that they are receiving from another exchange or another custody provider. So and what they will do with that information. So where will they store it? Will they store it separately from their main databases? Will they have restricted access? Will it be encrypted? This is information that has to be received and that has to be sent by an exchange. But where that information is then stored, it needs to be stored securely for data privacy and security. And ideally, it needs to be away from main database and general access where people can see it. The tied to that is something that we've been working on at GDF, and that will be made available very, very soon and we did this in the ML working group, is an onboarding questionnaire. So the way we sort of see that things developing is that we'll have travel corridors where one exchange will say, we're willing to send our customer data to a counterparty exchange. And to do that, they will start with an onboarding questionnaire that we've called TRIXO. And that questionnaire will help an exchange to look through a set of standard questions or answers from the counterparty exchange and say, yeah, we're happy to work with this exchange, we're happy to send our customer data. That document will be available shortly at gdf.io, where anybody will be able to then go in and download it. And as I said, the aim is really to help one exchange understand another exchange where they're sending their customer data so that they can feel confident that where they're sending the information is going to be, that information will be safe and will be secure. The other thing that exchanges will need to look at is screening. So what do I mean by screening? It's when you have, let's say, for example, an inbound payment from or inbound travel information, to be able to look at the name that it was sent from and just to check against sanctions databases or ASF or something like that, to make sure that that person isn't on a known sanctions list or anything like that. And that's going to require people with experience as well, so that the exchanges will have to get to know compliance and will have to build out a compliance team that can understand what they need to do. And then the last problem is more of an industry one. It's called the multi-protocol discovery issue. So each solution provider for travel has their own set of requirements. And for example, OpenVAS, which Jesse mentioned earlier, the customer will have to use something called a virtual asset account number, or VAN. So if, for example, I want Anson to send me some Bitcoin, I would have to give him my name, my Bitcoin address, and a VAN, which if my exchange uses OpenVAS. Now, if everybody uses the same system, so if everybody uses OpenVAS or Signa or Shift or Netkey, then it's very easy. If everybody uses the same system, then you just provide this same information. But if everyone is using a different provider, so if Anson's exchange uses something different from my exchange, I don't know what information I have to give Anson in order to make that transfer so that information can be supplied. So this is another issue that we're currently addressing, and the joint working group is now considering how that might be possible to solve this, so that we can really start to say, well, if one exchange is using one solution, another one is using another, then we can make it frictionless for the customer to be able to send information from one place to the other and know exactly what information they have to give to their counterparty.
Thank you, Malcolm, for sharing some very important issues with us, including the discovery issues, which is, of course, clearly mentioned in the FATF 12-month review report as well. And also, I want to thank you for Anson for your point that engagement between the regulator and the industry, also the engagement between FATF and the industry is very important to achieve a very effective implementation of travel rule. And that engagement is really what we've done in the past year as a FATF and as a GFSA. So before moving on to our final question to the panelists, let me share what FATF will do next and also what GFSA will do next. And first of all, FATF will conduct a second 12-month review in June next year, as I mentioned earlier. And second, FATF will provide updated guidance for private sector and public sector on the virtual asset and virtual asset service provider. And the guidance, the top issue of the covered in the guidance includes the travel rule and P2P transaction via unhosted wallet and stable coins, and several other issues that are covered by the FATF report published in June. And third, FATF will continue to engage with broader stakeholders, including the industry and academia and engineers, of course, including the blockchain community. And I think that's some of the very important points of what FATF will do in the coming months. So regarding the GFSA, GFSA will continue to engage with the industry as well as with the blockchain community. And also, we will continue to lead the discussion and initiatives at FATF on this front, given the discussion with stakeholders like today, as well as from dialogue with the industry and blockchain community. So let me move on to my supposedly final question to the panelists today. And that question is to all of you, all the three panelists. And the question is, what will you expect blockchain community and engineers to support virtual industry's compliance with FATF standards, including, of course, travel rule? And what issues need to be solved in the short term and in the long term? So who will come first? So maybe Jesse?
I'm happy to, sure, I'm happy to jump in first. You know, I think that in relation to expectation from blockchain communities, I think, you know, as I mentioned, we've been moving in the right direction. So I certainly think, you know, more application in relation to kind of building out the compliance programs generally. When it comes to engineering and compliance, I think one of the concerns that I certainly have going forward, you know, ties into, you know, kind of data privacy, data protection, and security. I think it's certainly something that's important, especially in digital finance as a whole. And, you know, one of the drivers that we haven't mentioned when it comes to travel rule was the potential concern around sanctions evasion, right? And you know, one of the concerns that I have is, you know, if you look at some of the legacy and continuing activity that's being executed by the North Koreans, right, by way of hacking of exchanges and kind of the volumes that they have been able to capture as a result of that, that's certainly something that's a concern for the industry. And, you know, better security will continue to address that, hopefully. You know, when it comes to the communities, when it comes to one of the things that may be, let's say, medium term, but we're starting to see that I think is important is as exchanges are implementing the core compliance, right, to meet the regulatory requirements that they have, the next advancement is what's known kind of as enterprise risk management, right? And that's the concept of, you know, essentially doing both qualitative and quantitative, as well as kind of a holistic review of your program and making sure that the compliance program and procedures, the tools that you have in place work. And if you look at some of the regulators that have, let's say, more advanced regimes at this point, they're starting to introduce enterprise risk management as well, either by way of questionnaires or, you know, in relation to their engagements that they're having with the exchanges that they're licensing and registering. And I think that's going to be a very important next step.
So thank you, Jesse. So next, maybe Anson.
Yes. Okay. So many parts to this question. So I'm more focused on the communication dialogue front with regulators and FATF. To me, that's very important. So for the blockchain communities, definitely will leverage IDEXA and the joint working group to continue engaging the different members and the communities to see how the progress is for the implementation thus far, and any challenges that they're seeing. So one simple example would be when we first did the IDMS 101 for the messaging standard. Obviously, we had a whole group of technical experts in one place for a number of weeks and came up with that standard. And then when the implementation started, we started seeing different changes or challenges that comes about, because theory and the practical aspects can be very different. So now we're reaching to the practical aspects. We need to see what other feedback the community has, so that we can feedback to the regulators as well as FATF in the different groups, like the virtual asset contact group. As for engineers, I see a very good evolution of the engineers in this space, from not only just about the tech of blockchain and cryptocurrencies, virtual assets, but now also understanding more about the compliance that's needed behind what is needed for the tech to comply with the rules. So most importantly is to have the firms starting to recruit more people from the traditional industry, or have the existing engineers really doing more research to see what the banking and the financial institutions are doing, so that they can be more capable in implementing the standards. So in the short term, I really think it's really a communication issue. One of the things is we need all the regulators to work with the industry much more. The strength must be much stronger. Harmonize between each one, not have one regulator be more strict than the other, and have a different sort of interpretation. In terms of long term, I think we're getting there. The June 2021 deadline, I think it's definitely achievable. In the long term, the industry and the regulators must also see the new trends that are coming, but at the same time, not to be fearful of the new technologies that are coming our way.
Thank you, Anson, for sharing your views. So next, Malcolm, could you please?
Yeah, sure. I think Anson highlighted the first one that I was going to think about there, which is the regulatory engagement and how important that is. Any solution needs to be practical, and that requires a strong level of discussion between the regulator and the industry to make sure that both understand each perspective and where there's challenges, how those can be overcome. And one of those challenges, as I mentioned earlier, is this multi-protocol fast discovery issue that we do need to address. And that involves both the discussion with the regulators, but also there's looking at sort of how you build out, and let's call it an infrastructure standard, as we did with IDMS 101, that sits underneath whatever solution VASP decides to use, or solutions that VASP decides to use. Then we'll likely move into pilots, and we'll see some pilots going through to the end of this year. And those pilots will then mature into something more substantial. And I think within seeing not only the commercial solutions, which might be fully ready and having developed a lot of the necessary nuances for travel rule, we're also seeing the emergence of some industry-built solutions. So one of them is called TRP. And they have a website, travelruleprotocol.org, and there's some, for example, code samples and a document that's ready in. That's really from a developer perspective, it's a minimum viable product. So it's not it will do the minimum using IVMS 101 to allow transactions to take place, really to test the rails and to start to use that standard. to begin with, and then to be able to then interoperate with other standards such as TRISA and so on. And then we have, I think, the engagement with the Virtual Asset Contact Group, which has been hugely beneficial, and we're looking forward to another year of that. And also within that, I think how non-custodial wallets can really be handled. So exchanges will come across these. How are we going to actually be able to address the issue that we can't collect data from non-custodial wallets? And then finally, I think we will see the emergence, as I mentioned before, of travel corridors. So we will see one exchange building a trust relationship with another exchange so that the information can travel in between those two exchanges. And those bilateral relationships will open up over a period of time. How that matures in the long term, it may be that you end up with trusted VASPs that are known to have high standards, that they won't need to do this sort of bilateral arrangement anymore, but may actually just be seen as a hub for where onboarding is permitted.
Okay, thank you, Malcolm, for introducing some of the very important aspects. So I want to thank all the panelists for sharing your insight and views. I think that was very helpful for the audience in thinking about what we need to do in order to comply with the travel rule, and also what the challenges and what will come in the next months and years. So I think you shared a lot of important things. So I won't summarize all the very important points, but I want to say that I'm very impressed by your insight and passion and energy, and I really know that how hard you worked in the past months and years, even under the difficult situation of COVID-19. But so I think I respect your initiatives and efforts on that front. But at the same time, we still have a lot of issues, practical issues, to address in order to achieve effective implementation of travel rule. So, as a co-chair of the Virtual Asset Contact Group of FATF, I will be very committed to have a more in-depth engagement with the broader stakeholders, of course, including you and your institutions. So I want to say, let's continue this hard work, and let's continue this conversation in order to achieve our goal. So having said that, I think it's the end of our session. And thank you again for all the contribution. And thank you, Jesse, Anson, and Malcolm. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the wonderful discussion. Thank you. モデレーションを務めていただきました羽渕さん、どうもありがとうございました。
And Mr. Habuchi, thank you very much for your moderation.